Hello, and welcome to Bias in Our Backyard. ADL was founded in 1913 in response to an escalating climate of anti-Semitism and bigotry. Our founders started ADL initially to fight anti-Semitism, but realizing that they couldn't fight one type of hatred without fighting all types of hatred. Working with allies remains a very big part of our mission to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. Today, ADL continues to fight all forms of hate with dedication, with vigor, and with passion. We are a nonpartisan 50c3 organization. In August, you might remember that we hosted a webinar along with several of our colleagues to debunk CRT myths and demystify its teachings. Since that time, we have realized that this is a topic that is not leaving the news. We have seen situations escalate in classrooms and school districts across our country and right here in our own backyard, hence the need for today's discussion. Every week, we are seeing stories in the news about book bans, harmful commentary made by educators, and contentious meetings at school boards and in neighborhoods. The situation has gotten so difficult in some districts that federal funds have been requested to enhance security. We have educators asking us all the time, what does the Texas bill actually say? How do I teach within the confines of the law? So today we wanted to bring a panel of experts together who can answer these questions, how it is impacting our curriculum, and what resources are available for your colleagues and our communities. We ask you to listen with an open mind and a curious heart and join us as agents of change in our own communities. We appreciate your being here today and our panelists dedicating their time to listen and to answer questions. We want to give a window into their world so we can better understand and be agents of change in our very own communities. Wishing you all a wonderful, happy, and healthy holiday season. I'm going to turn it over to Chantel.
Thank you, Cheryl, for framing our discussion for today. I am Dr. Chantel Henderson, Education Director for ADL Southwest Region. I am honored to introduce our presenters. Our first presenter is Seth Rao. Seth is the Senior Manager of Policy for Empower Schools. Seth advises nonprofits and educational institutions in Texas and across the country. Our second presenter is Aisha Davis. Aisha is a member of the State Board of Education representing Dallas and Tarrant counties. Aisha is an educator with years of experience as a teacher and an administrator. Our third presenter is Jennifer Warren. Jennifer is the executive of organizing and campaigns for Stand for Children. Jennifer represents Learn from History and has an extensive background organizing state and national elections. To learn more about our presenters, a link has been provided in the chat. After their presentations, we will address your questions. Our moderator, Sharesa Thomas, Education Director for ADL Texoma, will facilitate the discussion.
It's a pleasure to be here with all of you on this webinar this afternoon. I'm going to focus on explaining the overview of how we got to where we're at, and then I'm going to spend a few minutes walking through the details of what is actually in Senate Bill 3, which is the second bill that passed in the second special session this summer related to critical race theory disparities in the law. So I am going to get this up here right now. So hopefully everyone can see my screen here. So I wanted to start with this overview here of how we got here, which is a very incomplete timeline because we only have a few minutes today. But in August of 2019, the New York Times published the 1619 Project, which was a series of essays commemorating the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved Africans arriving in colonial Virginia. And this received positive accolades from many. It also received a backlash from others. And obviously, as everyone remembers, last summer we had a series of nationwide protests following the murder of George Floyd and countless other Black Americans who have been killed through all sorts of means. And as part of the presidential campaign, and I think we have to acknowledge that partisan politics make a big difference here. My job here in this overview is not to make statements about is just to explain the overall conditions of where partisan politics are playing in here. And we do have to recognize that former President Trump issued an executive order combating race and sex stereotypes, and also issued a separate executive order establishing a 1776 commission. And it is going to be very important that you have a reality that there's a big debate between where is the origin of this discussion. And I think we have to recognize that reality here. And then in the regular session of the Texas legislature, there was a bill that passed House Bill 3979, but this bill did not pass in the form that the governor and much of the Republican leadership of the state wanted. So there were further revisions made this summer in the second special session around Senate Bill 3. So as I move on to the next slide here, Senate Bill 3 does 5 things. The first thing it does is it sets up a civics training program and creates an advisory board. So that we'll be hearing from Aisha Davis later in this presentation, who is on the State Board of Education, which does have oversight over our social studies standards. The second is that this bill also allows for parents and guardians to have online access to instructional materials. We have to remember that this is also occurring in the reality of the pandemic that we're still facing, and that much of this movement is also being driven by the fact that parents were getting to see what was happening with their kids' education over the past almost 2 years now. So that this bill does say that parents and guardians have access to any instructional materials that are going to be shared digitally with their students. The third is that the State Board of Education was already in the process of rewriting the TEKS, which are the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills for social studies, and that this bill slightly accelerates that process so that by this time next year, we will have revised our social studies standards here in the state of Texas. I'm going to switch into talking about the fourth provision in here, which is what has gotten the most news and most attention here, which are the certain instructional requirements and prohibitions. So I'm going to walk us through this segment here. So this part of the bill says for any course or subject, including an innovative course, because when this bill was originally passed back in May, that this was just applying to social studies courses. But we recognize that we talk about these topics in courses that are beyond just social studies courses. So now this covers all subjects, kindergarten through 12th grade. At the moment, higher education is exempt from these provisions. There was some efforts to include higher education in this, but those were not successful in this. So this is really just limited to the K-12 education space. And so the first provision here is that a teacher may not be compelled to discuss a widely debated or currently controversial issue of public policies or social affairs. A teacher can still do this, but they are not compelled to do so. It cannot be part of the forced curriculum of any school. The second part is that a teacher who chooses to discuss this, they shall explore that topic objectively and in a manner free from political bias. I'm trying to give you as neutral of an overview of this language here today, but at the same time, we have to recognize that it is somewhat impossible to describe every detail free from political bias, that there are people come at these views with their own life perspectives, but this is trying to stick to facts and the primary sources. And one of my big takeaways that I want you to leave this webinar with is that if teachers are teaching facts and primary sources and not their opinions, there is nothing that prohibits them from doing that from this law. It is sticking to primary resources, sticking to facts of what happened. So the third provision here is that a school district, charter school, or teacher, they may not require, make part of a course, or award a grade or course credit, including extra credit for work that is related to lobbying at the legislature and trying to advance a specific policy outcome. There is a large exemption in this bill for, like, let's say you're working for American Airlines and that the student has an internship there. And that American Airlines, of course, lobbies on bills in front of the Texas legislature, as long as the students are not doing the direct advocacy themselves, that they are exempt from this. But a student could still, on their own, go write a letter to their state representative, their state senator. It just can't be an official part of a course that is for credit in the state of Texas's K through 12 education system. So then I'm going to go down here to part 4, which is there's a list here which has become, unfortunately, the most infamous part of this bill, and that it says that anything that can require or make a coarse inculcation in the concept of. And we're going to go through a list of a number of things here. And I'm just going to read them off here. The first one is one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. The second part here is an individual by virtue of an individual's race or sex is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. And this hits at a lot of things around white privilege. It's talking about having conversations because of someone's background, they are automatically this. It doesn't mean that you can't have the broader conversations, but making sure that it's clear in context that you can't label someone as a racist or a sexist because they are a certain background. Number three is that individuals should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of the individual's race or sex. Number four, an individual's moral character, standing, or worth is necessarily determined by the individual's race or sex. Number five, an individual by virtue of an individual's race or sex bears responsibility, blame, or guilt for actions committed by other members of the same race or sex. Six, meritocracy or traits such as hard work are racist or sexist or were created by members of a particular race to oppose members of another race. And then it gets a little bit more into controversial, even more controversial territory here with 7 and 8, and is saying that the advent of slavery in the territory that is now the United States constituted the true founding of the United States. So this is a direct backlash to the 1619 Project, that there is a clear intent upon our legislators. And I do again have to recognize the realities that nearly every member of the Republican Party voted for this legislation, and every member of the Democratic Party voted against this legislation in the special session. So this partisan reality does have to be reflected here on this. Number 8 is that with respect to their relationship to American values, slavery and racism are anything other than deviations from, betrayal of, or failures to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States, which include liberty and equality. That is where we're at. Then B is that you cannot, for the list of the last 8 items that I covered here, that no one can teach, instruct, or train any administrator, teacher, or staff member that they have that they can be breaking that. And so much of the Civics Academy, well, I actually think the Civics Academy may do a lot of work to enhance civic education, which I think many of us on this call agree that we need to be improving civics education in our state. But that's making clear that the civics education will also have, how do you avoid teaching these subjects as part of its training programs. And then last year, there's another piece here that is requiring an understanding of the 1619 Project. And it's very clear that there was some of the backers of the 1619 Project started handing out copies of the New York Times Magazine edition where it was published, and was being sent for free to schools all around the country. And it's the expectation that none of those materials will appear in public schools in the state of Texas. So I'm going to stop my screen share here, and I am going to I'm looking forward to hearing your questions in the chat later, because I know this was a pretty quick and blunt overview. And then I believe I'm going to pass it over to Aisha Davis to talk about this role from her perspective as a State Board of Education member.
Thank you for that, Seth. We'll go to Aisha. Thank you, Ms. Davis.
Thank you. I want to make sure you guys can see me.
Yes, we can.
All right, Seth, that was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. That was very, very clear. And that really, really got deep into what was happening this past legislative session. This is before us now at the State Board of Education. And I was really, really in tune to session and all those special sessions where we discussed this. And I do want to emphasize that even though Texas was going through so many things last year, this was consistently put as a priority on every special session. So in all the opportunities to talk about things like the winter storm that came and the COVID and everything else, this was prioritized every single special session to make sure that this bill passed through the way they wanted it to. So now it is before the State Board of Education, and we have not received any legal guidance on what it really looks like as we make decisions. So like I said, we've been keeping up with what was going on in the legislature, but we have not had any counseling about what it looks like as we have to make decisions about all of our courses now that we're under the rule of Senate Bill 3. The commissioner does do an update after every legislative session. that lets us know about those priorities and how the different priorities went. Unfortunately, Senate Bill 3 and House Bill 3979 were not listed as one of his priorities. And it wasn't until members started to ask, well, what is the agency going to do about this? Because we have so many concerns from our school districts that they did start to offer some guidance. At this point, TEA does have a website where they have just basic guidance about House Bill 3979 and Senate Bill 3, the differences between the two and the breakdown of language, but it's still not very clear to our teachers in our schools. And we have a lot of our school boards who are seeing groups that are coming and testifying in droves, accusing our teachers in schools of using critical race theory. So this is something that has really come to the forefront in education. Right now at the State Board of Education, we don't have any critical race theory in our TEKS. So the idea that we have to do so much to take them out, they're not there. So we're trying to figure out, okay, well, we have mandates now that talks about we can't do something that we're not already doing. And so there's a lot of confusion around it. So as we start to build that new social studies curriculum and look at those TEKS, we have to keep all of this confusion in mind as we're moving forward. So it's always helpful when you guys have different points of view or different expertise to reach out to some of us with those facts. I do want to give you a real example of how critical race theory has been used at the State Board of Education so far. We do have charter school adoptions every single year, and this year was no different. We adopted 3 charter schools to open here in Texas. 2 of those charter schools were opening in Black and Brown communities, and they wanted to empower those children with knowledge. So they wanted to use different resources that the students can relate to that had a lot of academic background to it that students can really use to build their knowledge. Well, once the bill passed and once everything was active, those 2 schools that were focused in Black and Brown communities were then accused of having critical race theory in their curriculum plan. And the reason why they were accused of that is because they said they wanted their students to be civically engaged and involved in their community. And they also wanted those students to read a lot of literature that had a lot of culture tied to it. And because they said they wanted to do those, they were accused of critical race theory. And so that's the way it's kind of being used and abused at the state level. So House Bill 3979 and Senate Bill 3. When House Bill 3979 was adopted, it focused on social studies courses. Then we had Senate Bill 3 that came through in those special sessions, and it was deeper, and it included all courses, especially innovative courses. And the reason why a lot of that happened is because we started to develop more ethnic studies courses here in Texas. We adopted African American Studies in 2020 and Mexican American Studies right before that. So with the passing of House Bill 3979, those courses were exempt from these rules. But once Senate Bill 3 was passed, now they fall under this umbrella. So now you have African American Studies and Mexican American Studies that must be reviewed to make sure that they're not in violation of any of these policies. And I do want to say that African American Studies passed unanimously with input from all of my colleagues in 2020, in April of 2020. But then again, by the end of the year, when all of these different rules and all these different talking points about critical race theory were coming about, then everything about that course changed. So over 2022, we'll take that course that was just adopted in 2020 to figure out if it is a violation of any of these rules that are listed in the new law. So I was mentioning our upcoming social studies adoption. In the year 2022, we will be looking at every single history course from elementary through secondary. At this point, we can take information out, or we can add information, or we can alter the information that's there. These TEKS that we decide on will last for the next about decade. So we have to get this right for our students. The last time that history was opened up was for streamlining in 2018. And that's a process where they cut out some of the information to make sure that teachers have enough time to teach everything throughout the year. Well, during that process, they decided to remove figures such as Hillary Clinton, Benjamin Banneker, and Helen Keller. And the idea was, they said that they didn't have enough significance in who we are as Americans. And it wasn't until there was a lot of public backlash that actually came back. So now we are here again with a history adoption. We will start with secondary. So we'll look at all high school courses. We'll open them all up, and then we'll make those decisions. In June, we'll start with middle school and elementary. The very first step of the process is to nominate curriculum advisors. We have a 15-member board. We have 7 curriculum advisors, and they've already started actually this week creating a framework that we'll use for the rest of the year as we're developing the courses. Throughout the year, we'll develop work groups, and this is so important. These work groups will have community members and educators who are interested in contributing to this process. So again, you don't have to just be an educator to be on a work group. Anybody who has expertise can join us. The State Board of Education members take the recommendations from the work group, and this is how we make a lot of our decisions. So if we don't have fair representation on the work groups, we'll get a lot of biased recommendations, and that has happened plenty of times before. So I'm always encouraging folks, get involved, apply to those work groups, and have a seat at the table to make sure that we're getting good information that we make decisions on. The way that you would apply for those work groups, I'll make sure to send that link out. There is a link on the TEA website. If you would like to search it, you can search 2022 Texas Social Studies Adoption, and it should pop up for you. On that website, you'll see a link for work group applications. You'll fill that out, and it will go to the member that represents you. We will select folks who have relevant expertise, and then you'll be placed into a pool where TEA will put together our work groups over the course of 2022. We'll have at least 7 or 8, maybe up to 10 work groups throughout the year. And so you have multiple opportunities to join in on the process. And even if you're not interested in joining a work group, we sincerely need folks down there testifying. I have already seen a coordinated effort from folks to come down and testify, accusing different schools of using critical race theory. And it is a very, very coordinated effort. We need folks who are down there telling us what the mandates really do say. If it is a negligent use of the law, we need folks down testifying about that. We need folks to also tell us new hidden stories that we don't know about yet. As we were developing African-American history, in Sugar Land, convict leasing, all of this was coming out because they uncovered those 95 bodies of victims of convict leasing while we were developing the course. So it was history in action. So come down with all those hidden history facts that we should have been talking about for a long time to make sure that we are putting that into our history curriculum. So that's going to last all of 2022. So you got to be in it for the long haul because it will be the entire year of public testimony, reviewing our history standards, and making sure that we do have some good standards that we are passing for our students. After 2022, we still have to be active because in 2023, we have to choose materials, and that is just as important. We can adopt great TEKS, but if we don't adopt great textbooks and resources to go along with it, we'll find ourselves in a place where we are now. So in 2023, we will start the process of identifying good resources to go along with those TEKS that have been adopted. And I will say those resources have to have the majority of those TEKS that we adopt. So we have to make sure that we have good things in place. So next year, 2022, with as this history adoption is going, we are under the umbrella of the law of Senate Bill 3. And we cannot violate the law. We have to make sure that we adhere to it. But as was mentioned before, the law is all over the place. It's all over the place, and it's very hard to interpret. And so now you have teachers and schools who are trying to interpret the best they can, and it's ended up being something that's not best for kids. One example that I definitely want to give you is that students are required to learn about the Holocaust. The new law mentions that they want history told from multiple perspectives. This was, if you listen to the discussion during legislative session, it mostly centered around slavery, talking about some good and bad aspects, whatever they feel like the good could be. But now when you apply that to different historical events, you really start to see how callous that can be. So when the school brought up the Holocaust, and the law says you have to give multiple perspectives, some schools have translated that as good and bad. And so now you have students who are actually told to think about the good of the Holocaust, which is entirely wrong. And so we have to figure out a way that that law is not harmful for our schools and our students. And we have to figure out a way that we can move forward with teaching truth to our students while this law is in existence. And in moving forward to our next legislative session, 2023, we got to figure out what to do with this law, how to make it better or how to take it away. But this is going to really, really take all of us coming together to work for our students and for our schools, to protect history and to tell the great story of America and make sure that story is being correctly told. So again, thank you so much for having me today. I'm sincerely excited about the questions. I saw a couple of questions coming up on the chat, and I'll be around for them. But thank you so much, and we'll be on to our next panelist.
Thank you so much, Aisha. I can't wait till we get to the audience Q&A. Jennifer, we'll start with you.
All right. Hi. Thank you, everyone. So great to see all of you here today. My name is Jennifer Warner. As was mentioned at the beginning, I am the executive of campaigns and elections at Stand for Children. But here today, really on behalf of the Learn from History Coalition. We are a coalition of about 40 education organizations representing the entire sector, it feels like. And we know that among our network, we're representing millions of parents, educators, and students who we know some of our goals here is to focus on ensuring that this isn't just a one-sided conversation or discussion, which it very much has been at this point in time. So that means making sure that the voices of educators, parents, and students, those who are most directly impacted, are being elevated and being included in this conversation, which, as I mentioned, is very one-sided at this point in time. Now, the Learn from History Coalition is non-political. That means we don't advocate for particular pieces of legislation or for or against elected officials. We really do just want to make sure that people understand, one, what is actually being taught in schools, and two, the ways that these bills are impacting, whether they intended to be or not, are impacting not only educators, but of course, the education that students are getting, which then of course leads to the skills that we know they need to not only create a better future, but to be the leaders that we need. And that's really a side of this story that is not being told yet. So I just want to note that you've heard from Seth and from Aisha about the ways in which these bills are written and what they actually mean you can and cannot do. But I'm going to really talk about the ways that it's being felt and experienced, both by educators, which many of you can speak to, but also for parents. So this doesn't necessarily mean what the bills actually allow you to do legally or not, but the chilling effect that this has brought on for educators, for school system leaders, and the confusion, I think, that is out there for parents as well. So as I mentioned, a part of the coalition is our messaging and communicating. And so we commissioned a survey of 2,000 registered voters in late summer of this year. And I think it's really important to start in this grounding of what folks actually believe. And a broad bipartisan majority of Americans believe a couple of really important things. One, that students need to learn a thorough, accurate, and fact-based account of American history, that they trust teachers to do that work, both to teach the great parts of history as well as the hard and complex parts of history, and to lead those discussions for our young people so that they're developing the skills, the critical thinking skills, the empathy skills that we know are so imperative in our young people and our next generation of leaders. They also believe that racism is in fact currently happening, a widespread problem, and is harmful to society, and that it is not only an individual problem, but is also a systemic problem. And they see schools as a place, a very important place for that education of recognizing racism and learning that it is wrong to be happening. The other thing that that we have learned, and this has come up really since the Virginia elections, and I only raised this election again not to be partisan, but because it's the most recent kind of real-time response we have of people to understand whether or not voters, general public is making decisions about CRT in their schools. And really what we have found is that most people don't know what CRT is. They don't understand what critical race theory is. And that's why this is so, has really kind of been such an issue, because there are other people filling in the blanks of what that means, and it's not accurate. What we do know is that the last 2 years now of a COVID pandemic are stressful and have been stressful and continue to be stressful and anxiety inducing. And that a lot of parents are feeling that COVID has exacerbated many inequalities that really already existed. Things like learning loss, needing extra help in schools to provide extra help for students to catch up, to stay caught up with their classes, and that this pandemic has meant that has started to impact even more students, and quite frankly, students and families in more well-resourced school districts and neighborhoods who did not expect to experience this issue. And so they're trying to figure out what to do and what it means for them, and what they can what responses are available to them. This is certainly not meant to condone behavior and actions, particularly when we're seeing some of that really come out in very violent ways in schools, but it is to give a sense of one, just a reminder that the majority of Americans are with us, but also that there is anxiety and concern and fear that people have. And so when we are trying to combat a misinformation campaign or to engage with people who are feeling anxious and fearful, the thing that we should be doing most of all is being transparent. And that's what we in our research has shown is the most impactful. So I would urge all of you, and this is going to be in the links that we share with the conclusion of today's webinar, but Learn from History Coalition has put together a guide for school system leaders and a guide for school board members, both done in partnership with AASA and the NSBA, as well as our other partners who work with educators, superintendents, other school system leaders, to really talk about the ways we can be proactive. And I know it's going to feel a little scary to raise your hands and talk about this if it hasn't come to your school district yet, but we know that it will be. And most importantly, we know that when people think that there is something going on and they don't have access to that information, that's where misinformation is able to live, breathe, and grow. So our guides remind people to, number one, be unequivocal about what you teach and why. It is important for community members, for all of us, to remember why it is we have public education, what it is that we're teaching, the skills that it is building in our students for the benefit of all of us in the future. Making sure that we are being unequivocal about our beliefs, about our philosophies of ensuring that every student feels included, feels a sense of belonging, has a way to manage and deal with the emotions that they're feeling or those of others, and be empathetic. These are the hallmarks of our public education system, and we need to remind everyone of that and stand in it. So a couple of key points to take away in how we talk about this issue with parents, teachers, the general public. Number one, always start with our shared values and what we believe. Number two, when talking about the impact of these laws, it's always important to bring people back to the ways in which these bills can, in fact, and in practice, shortchange our students, the skills that it costs our students. So, for example, when we have bills that make people censor, educators, teachers censor the conversations we're having in the classroom, that is depriving students of the critical skills, thinking skills they need for the future. Number three, in addition to talking about the skills that we are building in students, it's also important to connect that to our future. We all have a hope, and particularly when it comes to students, thinking about that better, more perfect union that we can be creating when we're developing these kinds of leaders. So again, as an example, teaching an accurate and thorough history so that students can learn from past mistakes and create a better future for us all. These are really important concepts that we make sure that we're rooting our conversations in. And then finally, last piece of advice, particularly as someone who is not an educator, I would remind us to think about what terms we are using that are actually pretty jargony, that might be something we use on a regular basis within our profession, but actually don't sound or have full understanding, the general public would have full understanding of what that means. So again, for example, terms like social and emotional learning might sound like it's pretty self-explanatory, but it can, depending on what people's experience with that term is. And again, in the case of a campaign that is built on misinforming people about terms that they don't understand, it's important for us to not just say we believe in social emotional learning, but talk about what does that actually mean? How would regular everyday people talk about it? So again, for example, I would say social and emotional learning is helping kids understand their emotions, right? Or culturally relevant curriculum. I might instead say we work to make sure every student knows they belong and feel welcome. So those are just a few tips. And I know, again, I had to go through it really fast as well to make sure we stay on time, but we have all of this in writing that we're happy to share with you and will be included in our links. Thank you so much.
There you go. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was amazing, so informative. And I'm glad the last thing that you said was about using certain terms that we kind of assume that use these educational terms and assume that the larger public may be aware of those. I'm in charge of the post-event email that will go out listing all of our resources. And I'm going to make sure to attach some definitions and terms that we in ADL education use. And so I think that's going to be a great addition to share with our registrants in our community. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to ask my panelists to take themselves off mute and on camera. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and then we're going to get right into the audience question. So I skipped my introduction because I was so busy thanking Jennifer, but my name is Sharissa Thomas, and I'm the Education Director for Texoma. And I want to first thank the panelists for coming and sharing all this wealth of knowledge for us. You've made us smarter. You've made us, you've helped clear up some very murky waters for us. So thank you so much. And of course, you've empowered us with so many different resources. I can see the chat going crazy with Aisha's link, with Seth looking at his policy. They're already looking at Jennifer's website. So that's a great thing. I want to get to the audience questions. So I had several questions for you all. And Aisha, you and I are friends. So I'm going to talk to you again more about the curriculum. I can't wait for us to have a deeper discussion. The first question I want to ask all of you, and I'll open it up to all of our panelists, Seth, Aisha, and Jennifer, is about the enforcement of this law, right? We know that if you have a law, then and if someone violates that law, there are consequences. And so one of the things I think educators and really all of our stakeholders are concerned about is what happens if they are guilty of offending in some way. This very subjective and very broad bill already. What are the consequences for our educators? Are there clear consequences? How does that affect their performance evaluation? Is there a grievance route for these educators? So that's a question I'd like to ask you three to weigh in on.
Sure, I'll start off with it, but obviously happy to defer as well. So in the bill, and one of the provisions of the bill that I did not cover in the overview, it says that you you can't have a claim in court against a teacher for this, because we know that there are some parents that wanted to bring in the US judicial system into this process. So a teacher, there's no cause of action against a teacher in the court of law on this. How this is going to be enforced, TEA did not, there was no fiscal note with this part of the bill. Well, there was a small implementation for the social studies TEKS, but as everything is coming together there, it has been an interesting process. It's not like TEA is going to go hire 2,000 monitors to go out around the state or go police this. There's no video camera enforcement. We do have some video cameras in special ed classrooms in the state of Texas, but the real way of enforcing this is going to be students that are saying things on social media, parents that are hearing things, and then the process for a complaint is going through the normal complaint to either your school board or your charter school governing board in the state. So we already have processes for parent grievances in all of our school districts and charter schools in the state of Texas, and they should follow those processes. That obviously begs the next question, which is, okay, if you have a school board that is more concerned about these issues. I was watching a school board meeting this morning from a rural part of our state. Well, actually not such a rural part of our state, but a part of a city in West Texas where this exact subject came up, and they used it. They claimed that a couple of their schools were teaching critical race theory, and immediately a school board member jumped in and said, no, they're not teaching critical race theory, and that's not actually happening here. But it's going to be up to local jurisdictions to determine this stuff, and it's going to be, so that's why, like, I cannot overemphasize this. I know I've talked to some of you offline in person. It's like local school boards matter. Who is in these positions really matter if you want to see your values lived out in your community.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. Aisha or Jennifer, would you like to weigh in on that same topic?
Yeah, he's absolutely right. And so what we have is a lot of organized parent groups who come and accuse different teachers or schools of using critical race theory. And since there is really no oversight from TEA or anybody, you know, they're just accusing them, and there's really no way to kind of figure out, you know, whether or not there is any legal backing for what they're even saying. So yeah, that he was absolutely right in there. Right now, the law does not say that there is a governing body that looks over who you can send these complaints to, and they'll come out and do something and take you to jail. There is no remedy that says, you know, you'll lose your teacher license if you're, you know, found guilty by TEA. So there is really, that's very unclear.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Jennifer, if you wanted to weigh in, fine. If not, we can move on to the next question. Okay. Okay. Seth pointed to some, he used a phrase that brings up my next question, these rural school districts. So Aisha, you talked about the curriculum review and how important that is. And many of our larger school districts like DISD or in Houston or in Austin, they have access to a lot of other supplemental materials that they use. But many of our rural areas really depend and lean on the textbook and the curriculum because they may not have funds for ancillary materials. If we have to if they're rewriting the curriculum and they're taking so many things out, how is this policy and how is this revision going to directly impact these rural school districts and their access to additional information, to pull in things, and to really teach a broader view of the education experience, the social studies content?
I'm so glad and grateful that you brought that up. So I mentioned in 2023, that's when we'll choose the resources. So that has a whole process of public hearings, folks coming down and testifying. We just went through this in health. And so in health, we had a lot of parents who didn't want students talking about anything related to sex ed. Yeah. And because that pressure was so great, my board decided not to adopt any materials at all for elementary health. So right now in Texas, there are no materials that are adopted for elementary health. And the same thing could possibly happen with history. We can adopt all these great TEKS and then turn around and you have resources who want to make sure that all that good material is in it. Well, if we have a lot of pressure saying that, oh no, this is critical race theory, then it is possible we will not adopt anything at all. And our rural schools will not have any adopted resources. And I have asked, well, what does that mean? And that has not happened in about 20 years in the state of Texas. So nobody knows what that's going to mean. So we're going to see what happens with health with no resources. But it is very possible that some crazy things will happen in 2023 when we do that resource adoption. So yes, thank you so much for that question.
Awesome. Thank you. Jennifer, you are our resident resource guru. I'd love to hear what you have to say about those resources. And yeah, so I'd love, and also for, and not just for educators, but it's also relevant to our parents. I've been using this phrase called the guardian of good. These parents who we know that our education is being impacted. What can I do at home? What other things can our community organizations use to pull in so that we can bring these things that aren't being taught in the school district? What can we use?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I would say the first thing is that this is why it's so important that we are informing parents and having them speak up, because this is the stuff that we really miss about policy. You know, we think, oh, okay, I've been protected, so this thing that I'm not totally sure about, but maybe sounds bad, isn't here, and so we should be good. We really do need to make sure people understand the ways in which this is impacting the things they did not intend for it to be, right, as parents. And Texas, unfortunately, has been one of those states kind of leading that, particularly in books that are getting banned. That's a thing that we are starting to see among with Stand for Children, our own parent base and folks who are organizing are like, wait a second, these are beloved books. Why is this getting caught up in these bills? And I think that's actually a really important part and piece of this entire puzzle. And so we're really focused on making sure that parents are understanding that. And I think that's where this parent and teacher partnership is so important, because as teachers, you understand how you go about teaching these difficult issues or keeping topics, particularly around social studies, relevant to the things that are happening today and the ways in which that creates critical thinking. And so, you know, having that partnership is really important. That said, we have also been working with parents across the country who are, you know, kind of as part of parent-teacher organizations, hosting their own events. We have a group called Heroes, which I'm happy to send more information about that to you, Sheree, so that we can get it out to other folks. But this is something parents are doing in partnership with their school that is really looking at their own community and the history of, you know, different issues and how they played out in their community. So as an example, they did a walking tour of their school district that was outlining redlining. And, you know, this was a topic that they were talking about in school, and they could say, you know, this isn't just a thing that happened back here or, you know, happened in this other part of the city or the country, but this is how it happens in our neighborhood. And that was something, you know, something that they've been doing. And I think those are really important and powerful, but it's also not a substitution for the need for these things and conversations to be happening in our schools.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I love that idea of this walking tour and how you physically can feel how redlining was impacting your community. Thank you so much for sharing that. I want to get to some of the audience questions. I have other ones personally, but I'm not going to be selfish with your time and your conversation. I want to go right to audience questions. One of the first questions, one of the many questions we have is excellent, is talking about addressing anti-Semitism. And the question asks, do you believe that this environment is going to increase anti-Semitism? And also there's a question about a Jewish American history course. Is there one in the mix? And do you think that this new bill, in the one in the pipeline, I'm sorry, not in the mix, in the pipeline, and do you think that these bills could impact the passage of those, of that education course?
Sure. I'll start off here on this right now. In terms of anti-Semitism, as someone who is Jewish, I look at this and I see what's happened here in Austin in the last few weeks and much around our state and around the country that, yeah, there's no doubt that these types of environments only add fuel to the fire on anti-Semitism, all types of racism. Like, this is something that, like, when you're seeing this is what the leaders of our state are deciding to prioritize over, I don't know, fixing an electrical grid or other problems that you're seeing, you can see that, yeah, this is leading to an environment where it seems that this is welcome towards people who are going to be hateful towards others. And that's just where we're at. It's a depressing statement to make. In terms of this, I mean, I'd like to commend Aisha and her colleagues on the State Board of Education for having already passed a African American Studies, a Mexican American Studies course. I think there's a bunch more elective courses that we could pass, including a Jewish American history course that could be part of this, that there are many groups that have made up our, I mean, if we look at it, Texas added 4 million people in the last, from 2010 to 2020. 3.5 million of them are people of color. There are people who are adding into different backgrounds, and we have a really diverse state. And we know that the Jewish community plays a part in the diversity of our state, and there could definitely be opportunities for that in the future. That likely wouldn't run through legislation. It would likely run through a state board course adoption. Aisha could speak more to that process as well. But there's definitely opportunities to do this. One thing I will urge, and it's really hard, in this, especially in the rewriting of the social studies standards, is that we only have so much time to teach our students. So a lot of these courses will likely be elective courses, but I do think that we have started to integrate certain parts of the Holocaust into our social studies TEKS and trying to figure out like what are the essential things for students to know, and then what can be offered as elective courses like the ethnic studies courses that have been approved by the State Board of Education. Because as much as we'd like for students to know everything, there's only just a limited amount of time in the curriculum, which is just what it is.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Did either one of our panelists want to address the anti-Semitism or Jewish American class question?
I will say there is no Jewish American history course in the pipeline. Right now, we do have Asian American studies and Native American studies that were being worked on. But after these bills passed into law, those school districts stopped because they were scared, because they didn't understand what would happen and the implications behind having those courses. And we do have some districts that do offer African American studies and Mexican American studies, but they've taken it out of their course catalog as a direct result of this law. So we're seeing this in different parts of Texas. I do want to say, if you guys are interested in a course and it sounds amazing, I would love to tell you, you don't have to wait for legislation to start pushing that course forward. You adopt the course, come up with that curriculum, find a school district that's willing to be a pilot, and then submit it to the Texas Education Agency to be a course that can be adopted statewide. So all you do is come up with a curriculum, have a school district that's willing to do it as a pilot, and then we can take it and figure out how to make it a statewide course, and that's how it can be adopted.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to get to some more of these great questions. And by the way, if we don't get to your question, in the link that we provided to your bios, we did provide the contact information for our 3 panelists. So they've been gracious enough to make themselves available via email if you have other questions for them specifically. Okay, now one of the next questions is the bill partly pushed so hard because the state knew that they were rewriting the social studies curriculum? So I think this question is getting at, is there a correlation between this anti-CRT bill and the curriculum? Is there a correlation with timing between the two?
I mean, a little bit, but not really. I mean, this is really being driven by national trends. I mean, we look at this, my job, even though I'm based here in Texas, I was at the West Virginia State Capitol on Monday and Tuesday doing work. I do work all over the country. And we have seen over a dozen states pass laws that are similar to this. This has really been a national movement. Jennifer, I mean, you're probably doing a lot of national work as well. So I'd pass it over to you to say anything more on that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think how to make sure to keep this nonpartisan, but you know, the facts are that we are seeing this legislation move across the country, mostly or really 100% in states where Republicans are introducing it, and the language from state to state is all very similar. It would appear to be an issue that is being raised, not just anti-CRT, but anti-masking, vaccine, other issues like LGBTQ representation in schools, sex education. These are all issues that are being used from a political party for power and gain, and which is why I think they're very vague and they don't actually have any like really trying to address a problem, and at the same time, though, of course, does not change or diminish the real harm and impact it is having, again, on our educators and students. And so why we need to be calling that out and in raising this issue up from our side.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that question. There are several questions here that are really just about particular content that teachers are using or covering or lessons? And would they get in trouble for that? For instance, so I'm going to bundle those together and ask you, would an educator get in trouble for having a person celebrating Black History Month or having a particular speaker who's an activist come and speak to their class? Also, there is a question about a Texas history lesson, which I love because I taught Texas history, that talks about the Alamo and how Texas, they fought for independence from Mexico because of their desire to keep slavery. And so there are a number of questions that are directly connected to an educator's lesson that truly talks about slavery or systemic oppression, and would they get in trouble for dealing with that?
So I think this is so much of this comes down to what is the content of what is being said, not what I want to make it very clear, like, let's celebrate Black History Month. Let's celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. Let's celebrate Native American Heritage Month. Like, let's celebrate let's celebrate all Texans here, especially as we're going through this. And if you're going to look at, like, for example, the Alamo book, I did read the book over the summer. I thought it was an interesting thought perspective. If I were a teacher who was teaching that, yeah, I think it is, if you're going to go teach that, there's also Jerry Patterson, our former land commissioner, wrote a bullet by bullet response to nearly every claim that is being made in the book. So if I were to go teach that text, I would also want to include, whether it's from Jerry Patterson or from some other historians, that presents a quote unquote more traditional view of the Alamo. So I would want to, that is a topic that I think you would want to present both, unlike the Holocaust, which, like, you should not be presenting both sides on. I think on something like that, our current standards would ask for you to present both sides of the story on that. In terms of, I'm trying to think what else we had here. So, I mean, and then again, like, if you're bringing in a speaker, I think it's really around the content of what the speaker is saying. And if you're going to bring in someone who's going to raise pretty controversial viewpoints, I would be prepared to have a speaker who's going to raise contrary viewpoints to that. And in some cases, it might not make sense to invite that in. I think that is kind of a shame, but that is where that might be at some of the time. And definitely stopping some of these conversations from taking place was part of the purpose of this law.
Yeah, thank you for that very clear point about that. And that leads to our last, I'm gonna make this our last question, is could these laws be repealed if new people are elected, right? And so we've talked about the Texas legislature and who passed it and how many times it came up. Is this going to be here forever? Is there a way we can change that?
I guess I'll take this one. I started answering in the chat. I mean, the reality is that this has been very, very partisan at the moment, and we just went through a redistricting cycle, and the Republican Party drew maps that it would be easier for them to win elections in a state where Republicans have won every statewide election since 1994. You can fill in the rest of the subjective commentary from that.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to see if Aisha or Jennifer want to weigh in on that. On either of those, or if you have anything that you else would like to share with us before we wrap up for today, Aisha or Jennifer.
Yeah, I think there's some parts in that policy that are going to have to change next legislative session just because they're so bad for schools. So if we can't repeal it and get it taken away, at least maybe we can get some better language. And also the U.S. Department of Education is stepping in a little bit, however they can. They can't mandate curriculum, but they can have some say-so on some of the crazier parts that are in the bill. So hopefully if we don't have any federal support, we will get some good legislators who will take care of us a little bit better next time around. But our legislators did fight so hard. They're so hard for this. So I have hopes that next time around we will have some improvement.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Yeah, I would just make a final plug to understand your school board elections and get involved and get your family and friends involved.
Thank you. Great way to wrap up our panel discussion. I'm going to turn our closing over to my wonderful colleague, Jillian Bonnke, out of our Austin office. Jillian.
Thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate your wisdom today. I'm Jillian Bonnke, the Director of Education Programs for the ADL Central Division, and we thank you all of us for joining us. We hope that you found today's webinar educational, and we hope that you have a better understanding of the ground level impact that House Bill 3979 and SB 3 have across our state. I'm hoping you feel a little bit encouraged because we do have resources to support educators and community members who want to help navigate in this uncharted territory. Before we conclude today, we want to leave you with 3 things that you can do right now. This is our call to action. I have a call to action slide that we can share so that if you're a visual learner. ADL is dedicated to combating hate through education and advocacy. And we ask that you share, like Jennifer said, what you learned today within your own sphere of influence. Like Seth said, we intentionally celebrate diversity, and we promote, we work to promote understanding culture and affirming all identities. You can join us by supporting your local school district in helping create safe and inclusive environments for all students. Get involved, talk to your school district, look at those school board elections closely, and ADL and our partners have a full library of resources, including a wide range of tools and strategies for K-12 educators, administrators, families, students, and we're always working to promote safe and respectful and inclusive learning communities. So we ask that you follow us on social media to stay up to date. Check out our post-webinar email, which include many of the resources that our partners shared today. And we invite you to join us next year as we have other programs as we continue to watch this issue play out in schools and communities across our state. Have a good day. Be safe. Be well. Thanks for coming.